At our UU Climate Justice Revival Dialogue session here at Saltwater Church, all of us who were there drew pictures of our vision of a future of environmental justice. We drew trees and rivers, fish and birds and deer. We drew our beloved mountain. As we shared and spoke about our visions, at least one of us named that it had been hard to figure out where people fit in this picture, and indeed, many of our pictures didn't include any humans at all. One of us had even drawn their own family into the picture, but in non-human animal form. Dominant US culture, which is to say white culture, holds that we people are separate from the earth and its creatures, and the earth and its creatures can be understood as a collection of resources for our exploitation. Given that this is our culture, is it any wonder that we couldn't imagine ourselves in an environmentally just future? We've learned extraction and exploitation so well, we can't imagine humanity without it. But this culture that I was raised in, that so many of us were raised in, this is not the only human culture. Many Indigenous peoples across the globe have understood since time immemorial their community's place in the natural world, the ecosystems that they inhabit. Just because my culture claims that humans are separate from the more than human world doesn't make it true. And by listening to Indigenous wisdom, I can learn lessons of relationships that have existed since time immemorial, things that Western science hasn't figured out yet, but that are true regardless. There's also been a lot of hand-wringing lately across popular culture about transgender and non-binary folks. There's this idea that kids these days are making up new gender identities every minute. But the reality is that this is another way that white US culture is only just catching up to wisdom that Indigenous Americans have held for millennia, that gender exists outside the binary. Many Indigenous cultures in America and elsewhere had specific named roles for people whose lived experience wasn't dictated by the gender they were assigned at birth. And often, these people occupied sacred, ceremonial roles, necessary roles within Indigenous communities. Young white folks are putting words to something that the ancestors of this place have always understood. We're catching up with the cultures of this land that white Christian authorities sought to destroy. In 2020, the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly, made up of delegates from member congregations like ours, passed an action of immediate witness statement. This statement powerfully echoes in me even 4 years later. It was championed by Indigenous UU Minister Reverend Clyde Grubbs, and it called on us to address 400 years of white supremacist colonialism. The resolution reads as follows. Whereas 2020 marks the 400th anniversary of the first Mayflower voyage transporting pilgrims from England to the North Atlantic coast, whereas the Pilgrims' invasion of the Wampanoag people led to the enslavement of Indigenous peoples on the East Coast and the removal and genocide against Indigenous peoples across the continent, whereas many Unitarian Universalist congregations uncritically trace their origins to the Pilgrim Free Church tradition, a mythos that sanctifies white supremacy and depends upon the erasure of Indigenous peoples. Whereas white settler colonialism is extractive, expansive, and based in violent patriarchy, resulting in a preponderance of missing and murdered Indigenous women and creating unsustainable conditions for all living beings. Whereas the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, whose ancestral lands were invaded by the Pilgrims in 1620 and who have inhabited and stewarded parts of present-day Massachusetts for more than 12,000 years, came under attack from the Trump administration in March of 2020 and were notified that their reservation lands were being terminated. Therefore, be it resolved that we, the delegates of the 2020 General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association, call upon UUA and its member congregations to continue to gather in solidarity with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, Standing Rock Nation, and all Indigenous peoples struggling to preserve their lands, waters, peoples, sacred sites, and sovereignty. To push for the release of Indigenous water protectors from prisons, end public policies that criminalize resistance to extractive colonialism, and adopt a vision of prison abolition. To work nationally, statewide, and locally on policy that is decolonizing, such as establishing Indigenous Peoples Day, including Indigenous peoples' histories in public education curricula, and eliminating racist monuments, flags, and mascots. To work to stop and reverse ecological harm in genuine collaboration and taking leadership from communities most consistently impacted by extractive exploitation of land, water, air, and all beings. To research, identify, and acknowledge the Indigenous peoples that are currently connected with the land occupied by our congregations and find ways to act in solidarity with or even partner with those Indigenous peoples. And to examine practices related to Indigenous peoples, particularly the narrative regarding UU origins and UU holidays and US holidays, including Thanksgiving. Thus ends the action of immediate witness statement. Beloveds, as I read this statement, I am so proud that 4 years later, this congregation is doing that work right here at Saltwater. Through our partnership with Sound Alliance, dozens of folks in our community have completed the Wrestling with the Truth of Colonization curriculum to learn the truth about Indigenous history. Miriam led an additional book club last year to help us learn that history even more deeply. And one of Sound Alliance's action priorities is to see the Since Time Immemorial curriculum to educate Washington students about Indigenous history, given full funding and teacher training to ensure that my kids learn a more truthful history than I did when it comes to Indigenous people. This Sunday before Thanksgiving, I want to remind us that whether or not we choose to celebrate U.S. Thanksgiving, gratitude is Indigenous. Harvest feasting is Indigenous. In fact, all of our ancestors have feasted at the harvest since time immemorial. People have asked me, Reverend Alison, are we really doing another Pagan Wheel of the Year service again this month? But beloveds, it is so important that we turn the wheel together, that we find our place on the wheel, that we come to be in relationship with the land. This is the ministry that I have to offer at this moment of climate crisis, a ministry rooted in the earth, a ministry that asks you to find your rooting in the earth. My white siblings, we are not Indigenous to this land. Our people were Indigenous millennia ago, across a continent and an ocean. We will never be Indigenous here. So, if we are to be in right relationship with this land, we must listen to the people who are Indigenous here. We must learn to listen to the land itself. And we can learn different ways than the ones that we were taught, because right now, those ways aren't working. If you've spent any time on our church grounds, you'll have seen the English ivy, carpeting the ground, climbing the trees, pulling the trees down, and crowding out the other plants. Next Saturday, on the 30th, we'll gather here at church to pull up invasive ivy and plant native trees. This work of uprooting what European settler colonists have planted and replacing it with something that belongs here, this is essential work that we do on our grounds to steward our land, but if we are to find a future of climate justice that we can be a part of, I suggest that we must do the work of uprooting and replacing, not only on our land, but in our psyches as well. Because some of the things we've learned about being human are just wrong. Like the idea that we humans can't coexist in harmony with the planet that gave us life. People have done it before. We need to learn from them. Our opening words this morning offered us wisdom to survive an apocalypse. I remember in seminary when I heard someone say that for Indigenous Americans, these folks, they're already living in the post-apocalypse. The apocalypse began over 400 years ago with deadly epidemics, and it has continued with state violence, forced removal, and the US government ignoring treaties it made with Indigenous people whenever those treaties are inconvenient. If times feel apocalyptic to us right now, all the more reason to commit to learning from those, our Indigenous siblings, who have been surviving apocalypse since before my ancestors arrived on these shores. If we listen, we can learn to tend the earth in ways that nourish the human and the more than human. We can learn to embrace the sacredness of our trans and non-binary kin. We can learn true stewardship of the land that we inhabit and how that stewardship includes taking tender care of ourselves and each other. May it be so. May we be the ones that make it so.